through, emotional intelligence, you can create a level of psychological safety. And then people will learn. And then people are accepting of ideas because it's non-threatening. If you are, if people are going into fight or flight, when you approach them, then you're not going to get much out of them. Yeah.
Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. This is a show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by the fantastic Zahoor Ahmad. Zahoor is the head of social mobility, inclusion and belonging at the Co-op, a household name brand. Zahoor, you've had a phenomenal amount of experience, 2 decades in fact, not only working for retailers like the Co-op, which is a brand that we all know and love, but also working for organisations in entirely different sectors, from the MOD through to championing various other initiatives. Diversity, I know, is a huge, passionate piece for you, as well as really understanding some of those psychological aspects that make people tick. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Leila, and fantastic to be here.
So Zahoor, I know when we speak, we tend to go off on many a tangent talking about social mobility, inclusion, what works, what doesn't. But before we get started, I'd love to share with our listeners a little bit about how you came to be where you are today.
It's a great question, Leila, and I think it's true of so many careers. You don't, as an 11-year-old, you don't dream of becoming a D&I professional as you when you grow up. And 11 is a good age for me to begin my story, because I think that's probably where I peaked. Yeah, I really peaked at 11. So I am the sort of second generation migrant. So my father and mother, came from Pakistani in the 60s. And they were, my mother never went to school one day in her life. Yeah, my father had a sort of a unique scenario where he had some education, some high school education, but even though we were very working class. Because he had that little bit of education, he really drove the importance of education. And so at the age of 11, I ended up at a public school. It was back in the day of assisted places and scholarships and things like that. We certainly couldn't afford it, but I was in a public school in Worcester. And the reason I say that I peaked, because my experience in that public school was, it was quite a racist, systemically, it was there, and also very classist as well. So in essence, one of the things that people could perhaps forgive me for was my race, but they could not forgive me for being poor. And this was quite, and when you're 11, when you're a teenager, it really forms a part of you. And we were still in an environment where you rarely went home and told our parents about what was happening. This was accepted as part of the norm. But they built their aspiration as far as that school is concerned. And one of the interesting things about some of that schooling is that people ask me where my accent is from and things like that. Well, one of the things that you do gain when you enter into a school like that is the ability to, a certain level of eloquence, let's put it that way, as far as the English language itself is concerned, which has always held me in quite good stead. So I'm not going to completely knock that schooling, but let's put it this way: I didn't put my children through that school, so I chose not to. I thought it did more damage than good. And then I did psychology as a degree. I just wanted to go to London. I didn't even care where I went. I just wanted to get out of Worcester, which is where I grew up, and down into London. And for the first time, I found myself in a real multicultural environment in the truest sense. And that was good. That was a really powerful, strong period in my life. But then trying to get into work, out of doing a psychology degree, I began working for social services originally. And one of the interesting things that I began working on at that time was something called the Community Care Act. And what we found and what it began to educate me on was that there was a real difference in the way different groups of society were experiencing mainstream services. I always kind of knew this. It was all the stuff that I knew, but I needed it to be, front and center to really get to grips with it. I then entered into doing some work for something that they used to call the single regeneration budget, where you looked at disadvantaged groups. And so I was working with young people who were not in education, training, or employment, and trying to look at ways that we could re-engage those groups, which is something I did. I was really successful at the time, because I knew those communities, I knew those groups, and I wasn't that far sort of dislocated from them either. So I was, living right in that community as well. That then led me into a race equality council. It led me into the fire service. I spent about 10 years in the fire service in a range of different roles, from a head of equality, as it was at the time. Actually, my job title when I joined West Midlands Fire Service in 99, I think it was 2000, was head of fairness and equality. Yeah, it was an interesting job title. But from there, I went right up to sort of a director of corporate services. At which point, I took a little bit of a break because my passion from my teenage years was to write. Yeah. So one of the things that I was doing before we met up today was just spending a bit of time just working on I'm still working on the great post-imperial novel. That's my passion, alongside D&I work, obviously. Then I sort of re-entered the world of work, and I was only away from it actually for about a year, which was enough time to actually just write my first novel and begin editing it. And I then entered, worked at Royal Mail for a bit in business change, but what really got my sort of interest flowing back in the D&I world was the opportunity within the MOD. And when I then entered the MOD as leading their sort of D&I work, that was fascinating. It was interesting. Again, the huge area of work, which then led me into the finance sector as well. The finance sector came calling. There was sort of, a shout out to Skipton Building Society, a wonderful, wonderful organization. And there was an organization that wanted to do more in the D&I space, didn't know what it looked like. And one of the interesting things with going into the finance sector was that you've got the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, now saying actually D&I is a conduct issue as well. We need to think about this, so we need to ingrain this in how we are operating, which that's great. But there's some real basics as organisations that they needed to get right, and so we began working on that a little bit. And then 6 months ago, to the week, I joined Coop as head of social mobility, inclusion, and belonging, and that's been wonderful as well, because we're obviously it's the whole group. The nuances from the various different elements of the group and the various different functions within the group are very, very different, but also it's an organisation which is firmly rooted in its ethics and its values, and that's what drew me to it. So I remember actually in my interview, somebody was, the question I asked was, why do you want to join Coop? And my response was, well, you know what, it almost feels like my spiritual home, because when I was reading all the, our commitments to anti-racism and the history and the pioneers and all that sort of stuff, you suddenly find, Coop were talking about race equality in the 1860s, and so it's fascinating organization to be part of.
I've literally got a million questions, Zahoor, and without sounding too biased, because I sit on the Co-op think tank for inclusion, I think this is such a pivotal moment for you to have joined, and congratulations as well on the 6-month anniversary. I know that you're already making a huge amount of impact, but as a fellow Northerner, and shout out, I love it, to Skipton Building Society, I would be so fascinated to hear how you found the last couple of decades, because that's how long you've been in this arena, be it in different nuanced roles, and role titles, of course, have changed. I think it's fascinating that you have belonging in the title where you're at, because ultimately that is something that I truly believe is within the DNA of each of us. We all remember a time when we felt we perhaps haven't felt like we have belonged in a certain situation. But to work for institutions and organisations that are so well known by the British public, like the fire service, like the MOD, now like the Co-op, the spiritual home that you're now in. Talk to us a little bit about some of the differences that you found, and also what does it mean these days to be a forward-thinking diversity and inclusion and belonging and equity and culture professional, which is exactly what you are right now.
It's vast, isn't it? When you put it like that, it is the actual. The landscape is huge. So I'm reminded of about 2 years ago, I was doing a session to an audience on the history of race equality, and it was a 20-year history of race equality. And the reason I started doing it was because somebody had said to me, "Oh, we've made so much progress in 20 years." It was post George Floyd. And in this audience that I was just there as a member of the audience, this person then she said, "Oh, we've made so much progress," and that struck with me because I thought, have we though? Do you not remember Stephen Lawrence? Do we not remember all the findings of the Macpherson report in 2000? And the reason it was so embedded in what I was doing was because I was then, when I joined the fire service, one of the things that I was tasked with doing was developing their race equality schemes as a result of the changes in law, as a result of what had happened to Stephen Lawrence. And now, 20 years on, those things are still happening. The changes that I think we would have hoped for in institutions like the Met Police at the beginning of the 2000s, I think we can safely say today they did not work. They did not happen. They were in the news today as well. And that's no disrespect to anyone within the Met Police who are trying to make these changes. Because I've worked quite closely with the police as well over the years. So people are trying to make these changes. There's a lot of good people in those organizations trying to drive some of that. But I think the nuance and the vastness of the landscape is one that makes it more difficult because there isn't a blueprint for the D&I role. There isn't a blueprint for how to get D&I right within one organization. And what may work in one organization may not work in another organization. What's interesting with Co-op is that you've got our funeral care services, you've got our retail services, you've got our online services. Each of them needs solutions which are meaningful and pertinent for them, but also actually the problem statement is slightly different as well when you start looking at how diverse are they, how how inclusive are the systems. So in essence, I think we haven't made as much progress as we would like in 20 years. But one interesting thing that I thought is progress was about 4 years ago. My son, my eldest is a son. I've got 3 children, and the eldest is a son. The other 2 are daughters. But the son, so his name's Rohan. He came to me one day. He's about 15, and he goes, "Abu, you do a bit of public speaking, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, well, occasionally, son, occasionally." And he said, "Well, I need some help. I said, well, go on, why is that then? He goes, well, I want to stand for head boy in my school, and I need to give a speech. I thought, wow. The reason that was pertinent to me is because you mentioned belonging. When I was at school, I didn't feel I belonged. There wasn't a chance in hell that I would have thought I want to be head boy, or I would even have a chance of being head boy, or even considered. Yeah. But then here we are, a generation later, and he's standing for head boy, and he makes deputy head. Yeah. So he makes deputy head. And I'm like, wow. So there has been some progress. There has been that progress, because suddenly the generational change is there. He feels part of that, and he feels part of it enough to want to be involved in its leadership, if you like. So small changes, but it does work.
That is such a beautiful example, though. And, it really resonates with me personally. I think we had this conversation before, and we ended up, again, speaking for a very long time about it. But like you, I didn't feel that I belonged. Actually, it became, and that's another whole conversation around early intervention, especially when it comes to the education system, what is systemic, what is not. But that feeling when you're younger of desperately wanting to fit in, to blend in, to be the same as others. I wanted to be, have blonde hair, have blue eyes, be the same as the rest of my Western peers in primary school. And so the example you give of your son, who clearly has done a remarkable job to make deputy, oh my goodness, that is amazing. He has the confidence, he has the belief, the self-belief, and that self-belief is so important, because he knows that he has confidence in the future, because not only of what he can see. I know there's a big, strong kind of argument for you can't be what you can't see. I do agree with it to a certain extent, but I also think it is a lot about the nurture and the environment with which we're in, which gives us that confidence and capability to believe we can genuinely achieve many different things. But I have to ask, from your opinion, and be as direct as you wish, and I think that's one of the brilliant things about you, is you'll call a spade a spade. But what hasn't worked? You've had 2 decades worth of experience. What has not worked, and what has failed when it comes to diversity initiatives? Because we go through this cyclical process of almost diversity fatigue, and I see it everywhere I go. We see it in an evolution. What hasn't worked?
I was at a meeting once. There was a number of different colleagues from different organizations. And somebody asked me, how would you like your coffee? I said, I like it white. Oh, can't say that. Yeah? It's coffee with milk or coffee without milk. You can't say black coffee or white coffee. And I went away from that thinking, and this is a D&I expert, supposedly. Yeah? So I went away from that thinking, holy guacamole, what are we going to do with this? Yeah? So where it doesn't work, I think, is where we mistake motion for progress. Yeah. So lots of organizations find themselves doing this, where they will invest in speakers, they'll invest in events, they'll invest in a lot of those things. Does that shift the dial? No. Because you're not even certain what dial it is that you're trying to shift. That's part of what we want to do as far as inclusion is concerned. So what that means is that will make people feel included to a degree, but we need to be really clear about what is the outcome that we're looking for. And unless you are clear about the outcome, you can engage in a whole range of outputs. It will not give you the change. And subsequently, eventually, people will then say, what's it really giving us? It hasn't changed anything. We're still going to the same number of tribunals. We still have a lack of diversity at the top. We still have a lack of diversity applying. We still have a disproportionate impact in our systems and processes, because no one's looked at that. and that requires a level of nuance and a level of understanding. And I remember sitting in one room once where a very senior individual would turn around and said, well, why are black people not applying? We need to do more to get black people to apply. I said, well, actually, when you started looking at the stats, and I'd only been in this organization a couple of weeks at the time. I won't tell you which one it was, but a couple of weeks at the time, no one had looked at the stats in the years of them doing D&I, and they must have been doing it for a good 15 years before I joined. No one had looked at the stats to say, you've got the applications, you've got something like 25% applicant. So it's not that the organization is not an employer of choice for minority groups, but they're not being successful. There's disproportionately a lack of success for certain groups. And that's where you see some of the structural inequality that exists. And this is the stuff that Macpherson talked about 23 so 20 years ago. And subsequently, we still see its impact, and it's societal. And this is where the whole social mobility conversation comes in as well, because you're not going to fix all the ills of society. But what you can do is make sure that your own systems and processes are as fair as possible, and that you reduce that impact as much as possible. And it kind of reminds me of the ghost analogy. Do you remember the ghost analogy? Where so imagine you are a ghost, Leila, and you find yourself in a scenario where it's the end of the year and it's your performance review. And the head of ghosts comes down and says, right, Leila, how have you done? And you turn around and say, well, I said boo 1,000 times. And then the ghost turns to me and says, Zahoor, how did you do? And I turn around and I say, I said boo 100,000 times, boss. And he's really happy. Yeah. Right. Wow. You did. But okay. And then, a bit of intelligence is brought in and says, right, okay, what was the outcome that we were looking for? Because on the face of it, I'm the high performer here because I said boo 100 times more than yourself, or, and the intelligence comes in and the intelligence says, well, actually, the outcome that we're looking for is to strike fear in the hearts of the living. And every time Leila said boo, she did. Every time you said boo, Zahoor, no, nothing. Yeah. So actually, that's so the motion-wise, I was top of the tree, but progress-wise, zero. Yeah? And I think that's the kind of analogy to use when we start looking at why we are doing some of the things that we are doing. And when we lose nuance, and this is, I think, where the danger with a lot of this, tyranny is the absence of nuance, somebody once wrote. Yeah? And when you lose nuance, then you're in danger of using an approach which is a bit of a sheep dip approach, where you're treating, and I think somebody again, I think somebody once said, sheep dipping only works for sheep, because you've got a particular issue and that's what you're trying to fix there. But when it comes to a nuanced approach to D&I, then that requires a level of experience, a level of intelligence, and by intelligence, what I mean is data turned into a meaning. You turn the data into meaning, which gives you the intelligence, which then drives the interventions that you're developing. And that is how you begin to shift some of that dial. So whether it's, diversity at the top, so everybody talks a lot about, diversity in leadership. Yeah, absolutely, it's an issue. But then you look at the nuance on the diversity in leadership. It's not just about race. It's not just about gender. It's not just about social mobility and socioeconomic background. It's about the intersection of all three, or disability, or all the other protected characteristics and all the other experiences that a person brings with them, into that environment. And so, unless you have that true intersectional approach, ultimately you will only be partially successful. And I think this is where it takes me right back to your original question: why do they fail? Well, I don't think they fail. What happens is their success is only partial, and the vision of what that success is is not clear in either the people at the top or also with a lot of the D&I professionals that I've worked with over the years as well. And they start thinking about certain things, the outputs as outcomes. And I think that's something to really absolutely separate.
Do you know what's so fascinating? And also, I love a good analogy.
Yeah.
And so anyone who is listening in today, remember that ghost analogy. The brilliant thing about that is not only does it make a huge amount of sense, when you talk about striking the fear into the living, it makes me think a lot of certain diversity professionals that do use fear to move the dial, so to speak. But the issue with that is it's only going to be for a short period of time. There's many leaders, especially in today's environment. We're still in a very VUCA world, quote unquote. And leaders are fearful about what they do and what they say because of the impact on the brand and the impact on all of the individuals who are employees within the organization looking to these leaders to give them the answer, more so in an uncertain world. But fear is not necessarily the answer. As you've outlined, this is a multifaceted approach. We can't sheep dip it. The model for success is not single faceted. It depends on the organization. It's not a cookie cutter. What looked like good back in 10, 20 years ago, it's constantly evolving. Our sons, our daughters will look at things in a very different way than we do now. And so those that, and again, I sound terribly biased here, but the very best diversity and people transformation experts I have ever met have got incredibly strong emotional intelligence, a well-rounded breadth of experience for a number of years, quite frankly, and don't look at this as purely a personal vendetta is probably a strong word, but a personal mission that is only aligned with something that has perhaps been a chip on the old shoulder. And look, I put myself in that bracket for certain periods of my life. Actually, it's about the good of wider society and looking at all of those different idiosyncratic details that fit in and around social mobility and.
Absolutely, because there's an interesting element there, isn't there, about how how we elevate the narrative around D&I, because what you're talking about is sort of that more militant approach, and whereas I'm incredibly sympathetic to the militancy, particularly around sort of left-leaning militancy. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. However, if you want to make something work in an organization, you've got to be inclusive of your audience, your stakeholders, so that all your colleagues, all your customers, the board, and that is going to be ultimately a whole mix of people. So your approach must be adaptable enough to be able to take those people with you. Where I see a lot of programs, even good programs, fail or only partially succeed, is when they begin without complete sort of stakeholder engagement or stakeholder buy-in. One of the things I'm sort of trying to develop much more with the people that I work with within the co-op as well is thinking about the points before the beginning of a program. Yeah. So, for example, at the moment, we're very interested in inclusive hiring. We've started a program around inclusive hiring. Well, actually, there's a couple of points before the actual program begins where we need to socialize the ideas, understand the problem statement, get sort of that psychological buy-in to some of that stuff. And then we're at that sort of base level where the platform is right to be able to take on that information. And also, we know what we are trying to shift. Yeah, we're not trying to change the world. We're trying to shift X, Y, and Z. And these are the particular indicators that we'll be looking at. And that then makes it very real. It makes it very manageable. But also, you've done that element of creating that psychological contract between yourself and your stakeholders. Who are your peers? Who may be your bosses, and all that sort of stuff. So it's really important. And I think, the word, emotional intelligence is really, really key, because I think, at some point, somebody ought to write a book about, I'm sure that lots of have, but my idea around the 7 core aspects of an inclusive leader. And I think the biggest one is emotional intelligence, because I think it's probably the areas where you see it sometimes fail is often through a lack of emotional intelligence, either at some point in that pipeline, And so particularly when you think about something like behaviors and behavioral management, recognizing at a very early stage non-inclusive behaviors, microaggressions and micro inequalities and things like that. When people respond to say, "Oh, there's no such thing as a micro inequality," or that, at some level, that is a failure in emotional intelligence. And I think that's, or failure to develop that level of emotional intelligence. And that's the point at where usually I get Daniel Goleman's book out and say, "Here, read this. And tell me what you think." So there's a whole range of other things that play in, which is where I think that the D&I professional has a tough task, because they need to have that sort of that background. And I think one of the things that really works for me is the fact that, number one, I had the psychology background. So I was a graduate of psychology. And number two, then I worked in small organizations. I worked in the charitable sector, I worked in the private sector, I worked in the public sector, I worked in central government. So all of those types of scenarios then helped me shape and nuance the work that we're now doing within Co-op. And so when one of the things I sometimes say is, I really welcome tricky questions, because what that allows us to do is explore what we mean by certain things, but through emotional intelligence, you can create a level of psychological safety, and then people will learn, and then people are accepting of ideas because it's non-threatening. If you are, if people going into fight or flight, when you approach them, then you're not going to get much out of them.
And this is it. It's you and I could, and I'm sitting here nodding, aggressively agreeing with everything that you are saying, but we could sit here and agree with one another. How can we actually make the world of business and wider society a better place? Talking to one another. And I think sometimes diversity and inclusion professionals, they're wonderful, have great tenacity, but also are their own worst enemy, because are so passionate about the subject. Actually, we don't want to be necessarily preaching to the converted. This is about actually being accepting, creating a psychologically safe environment, as you rightly said, to allow others in and not ultimately berate them or hit them with a stick. And that, in my humble opinion, is where a lot of these initiatives fail, is people become so fearful. Leaders, having seen diversity and inclusion be, quite a polarizing subject, frankly, at times in Westminster, in government, think, well, I want to stay away from that with a barge pole. I'm not going to welcome it with open arms because I'm a little bit fearful. Why do I need to step up? Why do I need to put my head above the parapet? And you've hit the nail on the head. It is because we need to make a difference to wider society, but also we need to allow, through our discussions and action-orientated solutions and interventions when it comes to diversity and inclusion, to actually make that change and drive systemic action.
You find a lot of the arguments. So when you think about some of the arguments that happen, they happen on the fringes of the politicized, D&I. So if you think of it as a political thing, then it's on the fringes. So for example, that black coffee, white coffee scenario, that's like a fringe PC type thing, So you think about, when people say political correctness gone mad, or things like, health and safety gone mad, well, actually, there's a core where it's a really good thing to have, So health and safety as a sort of an analogy, well, at the core of it, it means you don't get injured, you're not put at risk unnecessarily, but the people love to argue about it at the fringes, and I think that's where we sort of, I try to sort of move away from that argument, because actually we're not talking about the politicized argument at the fringes. What we're talking about is the core element of what is equitable in society.
Indeed, and that is social mobility, which
Absolutely.
is in the title.
Yeah.
And again, sorry, I know I rudely interrupted you there, but social mobility, I think, is such a key to many aspects of diversity and inclusion, because it sits at the heart of everything. If we're to level the playing fields, you mentioned equity there, which is, back in the day, my mum and dad would have said, oh, we've got to treat everyone equally. They meant it with the best intention. There's an element of it that's generational. White coffee, black coffee, the fear over saying or doing the wrong thing. But actually, it's leveling the playing fields. It's just giving opportunity, regardless of all those different appearances, skin color, etc. It's leveling the playing field to allow us to break the system and give opportunity to all, which I think is so great about the title, and it's a pretty unusual title.
Yeah. Well, I think ultimately this is one of the areas which will evolve and grow and grow and grow, because we still see a huge difference in achievement, particularly when you look at organizations and the top tiers of organizations and their socioeconomic backgrounds. So there was a lot of work around this in the finance sector. And you saw that, the people that were making it to the top of these organizations are the people with the professional backgrounds. And then, if you even broke that down, then you could also see the privately educated and Russell Group universities and all those sorts of things as well. And it becomes really pertinent, because what it means is, ultimately, is there disadvantage in what we're doing as far as the systems are concerned? And I would say yes. So therefore, what can we do to alleviate the disadvantage? That's what we're talking about. We're trying to alleviate the disadvantage, because what that means ultimately for you as an organization is, if you are alleviating the disadvantage, you are then in the space of creating the best performing organization. It's as simple as that. Yeah. So you've met your sort of base case as far as the law is concerned, as far as the basics are concerned. Your ethics are right. You're thinking about it in the right space. And subsequently you blend that diversity and that inclusion in, and you understand the intersectionality that anybody brings with them. You will get the high performing organization, because that person will feel they belong. They will thrive at work. And if you have a team that is all thriving, then of course they're going to be a higher performing team. It makes psychological sense. Yeah. And I think that's the sort of space that we ultimately want to get into as organizations, as individuals, as teams. That's where we want to go. There is a bit of there's a level of emotional intelligence that is required to be able to manage and to lead those teams effectively. And I think that's that perhaps can be challenging for some people, but that's going to be a core aspect of a leadership competence, I think, going forward. And I think D&I will be part of that leadership competence. Do you understand D&I? So, and I sometimes joke when in some of the training that I do, I said, look, I'm going to do you all a favor. I'm going to give you the D&I question at interview. So when you go for your CEO role, the question you may get asked is, why is D&I so important to an organization? Yeah. And as leaders, we need to be able to adequately and effectively tell that story. Yeah. And because then it's part, it becomes part of how you operate. When we can do that, then we have seen a shift in the narrative.
I'm going to sound so biased here, but I honestly think those in the diversity and inclusion profession have the most challenging yet wonderful roles, because you have to be a master of influence. Not only do you need to be a master of influence mile wide and mile deep, you need to understand the science and the data, the methodology behind it, but you also need to have the art of persuasion, and that is a art. The art, as you said, of storytelling that. And I think in particular, in an environment where the stakeholder groups that we have, the organizations have, they're becoming far more intelligent, frankly. Investors, ESG, huge piece. There's a big trend for diversity and inclusion, and the societal aspects being more interesting from a customer, a consumer point of view, from an investor relations point of view. The list absolutely goes on. And so it's fascinating hearing your take on how things have really evolved. I'm conscious of time. I've got to ask one slightly provocative question here, because we've touched a lot on the system. How do you feel that the class system, which is kind of the untalked about piece in the UK, how do you think that affects diversity and inclusion now versus what it was like 10, 20 years ago?
Wow. So the class system, that's an interesting question. Well, so here we have a scenario where why? So here's a question. So this goes right back to Victorian times. Yeah. So my answer begins in Queen Victoria is on the throne, and essentially what we have is a whole scenario where individuals go to private schools, but they're called public schools. Why are they called public schools? Yeah, the reason they're called public schools is because those individuals who go to those schools are the ones that are going to take public office. Yeah, they're the ones that are going to be the leaders of the future. Yeah, and there's a real divide at that time between the rich and the poor. And our betters. As the way they are viewed. So the empire is run. The British Empire at the time is run by that class or class. Yeah. Now, what we then find is, and you fast forward 100 years. Yeah, so when Queen Victoria died in 1901, I think Queen Victoria died, and people didn't think the sun would ever set on the British Empire. Yeah, and then years later, very few years later, the empire began to change quite considerably, and it became a Commonwealth after the war. We then find ourselves in a scenario where, okay, so what does it mean for that elite class within the country? Well, the elite class is still there, quite clearly, and its influence is still there because then you find especially when you have a group of Etonians, millionaire, private school educated individuals who are running government. They can be called rishi, but they are still part of that. So if you like, Rishi Sunak is more like Boris Johnson than he is like Zahoor Ahmad. So that kind of scenario is still there. So I think it's still there. I think it's really, really strong. I also think, and there's going to be some good research around from the Social Mobility Commission coming out later this year, which will indicate also the North-South divide as well, and the difference between the even poorer socioeconomic backgrounds living in London more likely to end up in university than anywhere else in the country, and not just like twice as more likely, but quite a bit more likely. And when that report comes in, I think it'd be really, really fascinating. I think it's very endemic because these are also the lawmakers. These are also the the individuals that run our public services. They run the FTSE 100 companies. So they're the ones that are in the House of Lords, and potentially they are the lawmakers. They are the influencers. So they're all there all the time. And so the other voices are growing, but they are. Yeah, I think they've been lessened in recent times, particularly in the last 10 years. I think before that, it were, I think it was swinging the other way, and I think the pendulum has swung slightly differently. So it will be interesting to see what the end of this pendulum swing is. How far right will the pendulum swing before it corrects itself? And it will correct itself at some point. And then if, history is anything to go by, it will swing to the left slightly, and then it will swing back again. And it's always when it's at that extreme space that we find ourselves in a scenario where you see the biggest difference. This is why, when you look at the news and you find full-time nurses having to use food banks. Well, something is wrong. If you are working full time and you are in such a valued profession and you are having to use food banks, then at some point, government has failed.
What a thought to leave things on. And you know, material for a whole host of other podcasts.
Yeah.
This has been absolutely fascinating. I'm going to summarise very shortly, but I've got to ask one quick lightning round question. I'll give you 30 seconds or thereabouts to answer it. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your young 11-year-old self, not saying that you're not young now, of course.
I'm not young now.
But what might you say to your 11-year-old self, or indeed someone who's in a similar position?
Other than to take better care of my hair, I think what I would say to myself, more than anything else, you are not alone. You are not alone. It took me a long time to feel part of. I grew up in very different communities, and my life was very compartmentalized. And I just wanted to, and I think I would say, you are not alone.
Zahoor, it has been an absolute, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Where I begin to summarise this, I'm not exactly sure, but talking of class or class, talking about intersectionality, frankly, we could do a whole podcast on the North and South divide, but social mobility is a critical subject to the future. Emotional intelligence, psychological safety, really having a broad, deep understanding, not only of the environment around us, but also the varying different and far more increasingly intelligent stakeholder groups. All of these things you have genuinely shown the listeners and myself, a number of different thoughts and angles with which we really ought to be considering. I know that I'm going to be re-quoting the ghost story as well many a time, but it has been really fantastic having you. Thank you ever so much for being here today.
Thank you, Leila. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you too. Thanks.
My name is Leila McKenzie-Delis. You've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast show by Dial Global. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Apple Podcasts. Do download, if you would prefer, on YouTube and watch, or listen to the show notes. They'll be encapsulated at the end of today's show, or visit us direct, www.dialglobal.org/podcast. See you again very soon.